Dale Little here in Chesapeake, Romania. We'll pick up in the book of Daniel here in chapter 5, verse 13. Well, let's go back up to verse 12 and just recap, tie it in a little better. We actually read that verse last time as we finished, but let me back up to it. For as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams, and showing of hard sentences and dissolving of doubts, were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. And this is the queen talking to the king, Belteshazzar, reminding him that when the handwriting appeared on the wall, then Belteshazzar was at a loss, as his possible grandfather, and we'll look at that in a few minutes, Nebuchadnezzar had been. And we'll see that they always called in these others first, and they couldn't deliver, and so they ended up calling in Daniel. And same here. This is a little different situation, though. I think there was a good bit of animus here with Belteshazzar. I don't think he liked the Jewish people. He didn't appreciate them, and really had a hatred for them, much like the rest of the world often does. And so he knew Daniel was one of those, and so he had not been included, I don't think, in his people to counsel him like Nebuchadnezzar had. But at any rate, when the others couldn't deliver, then the queen came out and said, well, Daniel was able to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. Call him, and I'm sure he can interpret this. And so verse 13, it says, Then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. I'm going to stop right there for just a minute. We notice as how he describes Daniel here. He doesn't describe Daniel as being a counselor to Nebuchadnezzar, the king that really built Babylon into what it was. But instead he called him, you're one of those of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king, my father, brought out of Jewry. In other words, he brought you out of that because, he didn't have any use for it. And so we see here, though he does allude here in verse 14, I've even heard of thee that the spirit of the gods is in thee. Now, that term spirit of the gods is it's one of those terms that can be interpreted different ways. It's a little vague in a sense. And sometimes it can be spirit of the gods or the spirit of God, one or the other. Of course, Belshazzar didn't believe in Jehovah God anyway, so I'm sure he meant it just like it says, spirit of the gods is in thee. That light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. And so I see a certain contempt that Belteshazzar had here for Daniel and the Jewish people. And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of thee that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. So Belteshazzar makes an offer to Daniel, and Daniel's not too interested in it. You'll see. Verse 17, let's go on with it, and we'll comment some here. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king and make known to him the interpretation. You can see there's no love lost between these two. I'm not saying that Daniel necessarily hated Belteshazzar, but he didn't have the same respect that he had with his predecessor from many years before. And by predecessor, I don't mean the one that was right before him in that case. It's pretty evident that while Daniel showed respect to King Nebuchadnezzar, he had no respect for Belteshazzar. Daniel's name is Belteshazzar now. Although it was later bestowed on him anyway, Daniel was not interested in being the third ruler in the kingdom or having been clothed in scarlet and the golden chain. But why was that? There's a couple of reasons. One, he had no respect for Belshazzar. We talked before when we talked about, Nebuchadnezzar. But Nebuchadnezzar was a wicked man, but God was working on him, and it's through Daniel. And even though it was a slow progress and it took many years, Nebuchadnezzar was at least responsive. God had to do some things to really get his attention, but at least Nebuchadnezzar was open, and he did respond to the wooing of the Holy Spirit of God. And in the end, after many, many years, he finally conceded that God was God, who he was, Jehovah God, and was Jehovah God. He was God, and there was none other. So we see here that Belshazzar, though, had a contempt for Israel's God and for the Jewish people. There was another reason also that I think Daniel had a lot of contempt for Belshazzar. Belshazzar and his father Nabonidus, it said, murdered the previous king, who was still a minor at the time. And they'd taken over the kingdom from him. And so, very ruthless, very wicked people. Now, why wasn't Daniel interested in the possibility of being the third ruler in the kingdom? Well, Daniel had already, we talked before that the book was not in chronological order. Daniel had already had the visions of chapter 7 and chapter 8 that showed, and God explained and gave the interpretation even, that the Medes and Persians would take the kingdom. And so Daniel already knew the Medes and Persians had already been besieging the city. Daniel knew that they were going to take it, and the kingdom was going to be gone. And so why was he interested in being the third ruler in the kingdom that's getting ready to be dissolved and being taken over? And so he just told the king, you can keep your rewards, give them to somebody else. But I'll go ahead and tell you what the message says. And we'll see that only hours later, sure enough, that Belshazzar was dead. Here it is. It was night. They were celebrating, a huge drunken party. And the Bible says, as we'll see on down at the end of the chapter, that very night that Belshazzar was gone and the kingdom was gone. The Medes and Persians had taken it. So let's go on. Verse 18, it says, O thou king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he slew, and whom he would, he kept alive. And whom he would, he set up, and whom he would, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, just like Belshazzar's here, as he brought out the vessels that belonged in the temple to the Yahweh God, the Jewish God, and the God of the Bible. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beast, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointed over it whomsoever he will. Now that's a phrase we see over and over, especially in the early chapters of the book of Daniel. And I'll say this again. One of the main things that I was drawn to the book of Daniel. One reason I love it is because of the practical applications I see in it, the practical lessons. Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the king's meat. And the three Hebrew children said, when it come down to it, we'll not bow to the king's idol. And, if our God delivers us, so be it. If not, then we're ready to die in the fiery furnace. But the other thing is, one of the other things, is what we call the sovereignty of God that we see in the book of Daniel. And here it is. The Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and he appoints over it whomsoever he will. We get upset with our leaders at times, but God sets these leaders up, good or bad. As I've said, sometimes he gives us what we deserve, which is usually a bad ruler. But every once in a while he has mercy on us and gives us a good ruler. But either way, it's God sets up who he wants to. And thou his son, O Belshazzar, and remember now that note that the son can be translated as a descendant, because literally Belshazzar was not Nebuchadnezzar's son, but he was a descendant of his. Hast not thou, his son, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this, but hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of the house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives, and thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver, and of gold, and of brass, and of iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. So they praised all these other gods, but they took the utensils out of the house of God, the real one and true God, and as if he don't exist. And so Daniel calls out Belshazzar here and says, well, you built this big place, and but here God's got an issue with you. You're proud. You're arrogant. Think you've done all this by yourself, and you haven't. And so he's taken over. And so then he says, and we may have to cut short here again. I was hoping to get done. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, from God. And this writing was written, and this is the writing that was written, many, many tekel upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Many, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balance and art found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, and put his chain on of gold around his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now we'll take up there when we come back, and I'll go back and review these last few verses. But for right now, we'll make this the third installment here in chapter 5, and we'll finish up with chapter 5 in our next session. Dale Little, Rescue America Ministries.